Fall Apart, the book by Chinua Achebe, Chapter 11, read for you by Weirdo. Let's go! The night was impenetrably dark. The moon had been rising later and later every night. Until now, it was only seen at dawn. And whenever the moon forsook evening and rose at cockcrow, the nights were as black as charcoal. Ezima and her mother sat on a mat on the floor after their supper of yam, fufu, and bitter soup. A palm oil lamp gave out yellowish light. Without it, it would have been impossible to eat. One could not have known whether one's mouth was in the darkness of that night. There was an oil lamp in all the 4 huts on Okonkwo's compound. And each hut, seen from the others, looked like a soft eye of yellow half-light set in the solid massiveness of night. The world was silent except for the shrill of insects, which was part of the night, and the sound of wooden mortar and pestle as Nwayike pounded her fufu. Nwayike lived 4 compounds away, and she was notorious for her late cooking. Every woman in the neighborhood knew the sound of Nwayike's mortar and pestle. It was also part of the night. Okonkwo had eaten from his wife's dishes and was now reclining with his back against the wall. He searched his bag and brought out his snuff bottle. He turned it on to his left palm, but nothing came out. He hit the bottle against the knee to shake up the tobacco. That was always the trouble with Okike's snuff. It very quickly went damp, and there was too much saltpeter in it. Okonkwo had not bought snuff from him for a long time. Idigo was the man who knew how to grind good snuff. He had recently fallen ill. Low voices, broken now and again by singing, reached Okonkwo from his wife's hut as each woman and her children told folk stories. Ekwefi and her daughter Ezima sat on a mat on the floor. It was Ekwefi's turn to tell a story. Once upon a time, she began, all the birds were invited to a feast in the sky. They were very happy and began to prepare themselves for the great day. They painted their bodies with red camwood and drew beautiful patterns on them with uli. Tortoise saw all these preparations and soon discovered what it all meant. Nothing that happened in the world of the animals ever escaped his notice. He was full of cunning. As soon as he heard of the great feast in the sky, his throat began to itch at the very thought. There was a famine in those days, and Tortoise had not eaten a good meal for 2 moons. His body rattled like a piece of dry stick in his empty shell, so he began to plan how he would go to the sky. But he had no wings, said Ezima. Be patient, replied her mother. That is the story. Tortoise had no wings, but he went to the birds and asked to be allowed to go with them. We know you too well, said the birds when they had heard him. You are full of cunning, and you are ungrateful. If we allow you to come with us, you will soon begin your mischief. You do not know me, said Tortoise. I am a changed man. I have learned that a man who makes trouble for others is also making it for himself. Tortoise had a sweet tongue, and within a short time, all the birds agreed that he was a changed man, and they each gave him a feather, with which he made 2 wings. At last, the great day came, and Tortoise was the first to arrive at the meeting place. When all the birds had gathered together, they set off in a body. Tortoise was very happy and voluble as he flew among the birds, and he was soon chosen as the man to speak for the party because he was a great orator. There is one important thing which we must not forget, he said as they flew on their way. When people are invited to a great feast like this, they take new names for the occasion. Our hosts in the sky will expect us to honor this age-old custom. None of the birds had heard of this custom, but they knew that Tortoise, in spite of his failings in other directions, was a widely traveled man who knew the customs of different peoples, and so they each took a new name. When they had all taken, Tortoise also took one. He was to be called All of You. At last the party arrived in the sky, and their hosts were very happy to see them. Tortoise stood up in his many-colored plumage and thanked them for their invitation. His speech was so eloquent that all the birds were glad they had brought him and nodded their heads in approval of all he said. Their host took him as the king of the birds, especially as he looked somewhat different from the others. After colonats had been presented and eaten, the people of the sky set before their guests the most delectable dishes Tortoise had ever seen or dreamed of. The soup was brought out hot from the fire, and in the very pot in which it had been cooked, it was full of meat and fish. Ooh, Tortoise began to sniff aloud. There was pounded yam, and also yam pottage, cooked with palm oil and fresh fish. There were also pots of palm wine. When everything had been set before the guests, one of the people of the sky came forward and tasted a little from each pot. He then invited the birds to eat. But Tortoise jumped to his feet and asked, "For whom have you prepared this feast?" "For all of you," replied the man. Tortoise turned to all the birds and said, "You remember that my name is All of You? The custom here is to serve the spokesman first and the others later. They will serve you when I have eaten." He began to eat, and the birds grumbled angrily. The people of the sky thought it must be their custom to leave all the food for their king. And so Tortoise ate the best part of the food and then drank 2 pots of palm wine, so that he was full of food and drink and his body filled out in his shell. The birds gathered round to eat what was left and to peck at the bones he had thrown all about the floor. Some of them were too angry to eat. They chose to fly home on an empty stomach. But before they left, each took back the feather he had lent to the tortoise. And there he stood in his hard shell, full of food and wine, but without any wings to fly back home. He asked the birds to take a message for his wife, but they all refused. In the end, Parrot, who had felt more angry than the others, suddenly changed his mind and agreed to take the message. "Tell my wife," said the tortoise, "to bring out all of the soft things in my house and cover the compound with them so that I can jump down from the sky without very great danger." Parrot promised to deliver the message and then flew away. But when he reached the tortoise's house, he told his wife to bring out all of the hard things in the house. And so she brought out her husband's hoes, machetes, spears, guns, and even his cannon. Tortoise looked down from the sky and saw his wife bringing things out, but it was too far to see what they were. When all seemed ready, he let himself go. He fell and fell and fell until he began to fear that he would never stop falling. And then, like the sound of his cannon, he crashed on the compound. "Did he die?" asked Ezima. "No," replied Aquafi. His shell broke into pieces, but there was a great medicine man in the neighborhood. Tortoise's wife sent for him, and he gathered all the bits of shell and stuck them together. That is why Tortoise's shell is not smooth. "There is no song in the story," Ezima pointed out. "No," said Aquafi. "I shall think of one with a song, but it is your turn now." "Once upon a time," Ezima began, "Tortoise and Cat went to wrestle against yams." No, that's not the beginning. "Once upon a time, there was a great famine in the land of animals. Everybody was lean except Cat, who was fat and whose body shone as if oil was rubbed on it." She broke off because at that moment, a loud, high-pitched voice broke the outer silence of the night. It was Cello, a priestess of Akbala, prophesying. There was nothing new in that. Once in a while, Cello was possessed by the spirit of her god, and she began to prophesy. But tonight, she was addressing her prophecy and greetings to Okonkwo, and so everyone in his family listened. The folk story stopped. "Akbala do, Akbala ekeno," came the voice like a sharp knife cutting through the night. "Okonkwo, Akbala ekeno yo, Akbala cholu ifi adaya ezimao." At the mention of Ezima's name, Ekufi jerked her head sharply like an animal that has sniffed death in the air. Her heart jumped painfully with her. The priestess had now reached Okonkwo's compound and was talking with him outside his hut. She was saying again and again that Akbala wanted to see his daughter, Ezima. Okonko pleaded with her to come back in the morning because Ezima was now asleep, but Cello ignored what he was trying to say and went on shouting that Akbala wanted to see his daughter. Her voice was as clear as metal, and Okonko's women and children heard from their huts all that she said. Okonko was still pleading that the girl had been ill of late and was asleep. Ekwefi quickly took to their bedroom and placed her on their high bamboo bed. The priestess screamed, "Beware, Okonko!" She warned, "Beware of exchanging words with Akbala. As a man speaks when a god speaks, beware." She walked through Okonko's hut into their circular compound and went straight towards Ekwefi's hut. Okonko came after her. "Ekwefi," she called, "Akbala greets you." "Where is my daughter, Ezima?" "Akbala wants to see her." Ekwefi came out from her hut, carrying her oil lamp in her left hand. There was a light wind blowing, so she cupped her right hand to shelter the flame. Nwoye's mother, also carrying an oil lamp, emerged from her hut. The children stood in the darkness outside their hut, watching the strange event. Okonko's youngest wife also came out and joined the others. "Where does Akbala want to see her?" Ekwefi asked. "Where else but in his house, in the hills and caves," replied the priestess. "I will come with you too," Ekwefi said firmly. "Tufia!" The priestess cursed, her voice cracking like the angry bark of thunder in the dry season. "How dare you, woman, to go before the mighty Akbala of your own accord? Beware, woman, lest he strike you in his anger. Bring me my daughter." Ekwefi went into her hut and came out again with Ezima. "Come, my daughter," said the priestess. "I shall carry you on my back. A baby on its mother's back does not know that the way is long." Ezima began to cry. She was used to Cello calling her my daughter, but it was a different Cello she now saw in the yellow half-light. "Don't cry, my daughter," said the priestess, "lest Akbala be angry with you." "Don't cry," said Ekwefi. "She will bring you back very soon. I shall give you some fish to eat." She went into the hut again and brought down the smoked black basket in which she kept her dried fish and other ingredients for cooking soup. She broke a piece in two and gave it to Ezima, who clung to her. "Don't be afraid," said Ekwefi, stroking her head, which was shaved in places, leaving a regular pattern of hair. They went outside again. The priestess bent down on one knee, and Ezima climbed on her back, her left palm closed on her fish, and her eyes gleaming with tears. "Akbala do, Akbala ekeno." Cello began once again to chant greetings to her god. She turned round sharply and walked through Okonko's hut, bending very low at the eaves. Ezima was crying loudly now, calling on her mother. The two voices disappeared into the thick darkness. A strange and sudden weakness descended on Ekwefi as she stood gazing in the direction of the voices like a hen whose only chick has been carried away by a kite. Ezima's voice soon faded away, and only Cello was heard moving farther and farther into the distance. "Why do you stand there as though she had been kidnapped?" asked Okonko as he went back into his hut. "She will bring her back soon," Nwoye's mother said. But Ekwefi did not hear these consolations. She stood for a while, and then, all of a sudden, made up her mind. She hurried through Okonko's hut and went outside. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I am following Cello," she replied, and disappeared in the darkness. Okonko cleared his throat and brought out his snuff bottle from the goatskin bag by his side. The priestess' voice was now already growing faint in the distance. Ekwefi hurried to the main footpath and turned left into the direction of the voice. Her eyes were useless to her in the darkness, but she picked her way easily on the sandy footpath, hedged on either side by branches and damp leaves. She began to run, holding her breast with her hands to stop them flapping noisily against her body. She hit her left foot against the outcropped foot, and terror seized her. It was an ill omen. She ran faster, but Cello's voice was still a long way. Had she been running too? How could she go so fast with Ezima on her back? Although the night was cool, Ekwefi was beginning to feel hot from her running. She continually ran into the luxuriant weeds and creepers that walled in the path. Once she tripped up and fell. Only then did she realize, at the start, that Cello had stopped her chanting. Her heart beat violently, and she stood still. Then, Cello's renewed outbursts came from only a few paces ahead, but Ekwefi could not see her. She shut her eyes for a while and opened them again in an effort to see, but it was useless. She could not see beyond her nose. There were no stars in the sky because there was a rain cloud. Fireflies went about their tiny green lamps, which only made the darkness more profound. Between Cello's outbursts, the night was alive with a shrill tremor of forest insects woven into the darkness. Akbala do, Akbala ekeno. Equifi trudged behind, neither getting too near nor keeping too far back. Now that she walked slowly, she had time to think. What would she do when they got to the cave? She would not dare to enter. She would wait out at the mouth, all alone. That fearful place. She thought of all the terrors of the night. She remembered that night, long ago, when she had seen Obuagaliodu, one of those evil essences loosed upon the world by the potent medicines which the tribe had made in the distant past against its enemies, but had now forgotten how to control. Equifi had been returning from the stream with her mother on a dark night like this, when they saw its glow as it flew in their direction. They had thrown down their water pots and lain by the roadside, expecting the sinister light to descend on them and to kill them. That was the only time Equifi ever saw Ogbuagaliodu. But although it had happened so long ago, her blood still ran cold whenever she remembered that night. The priestess's voice came at longer intervals now, but its vigor was undiminished. The air was cool and damp with dew. Ezima sneezed. Equifi muttered, "Life to you." At the same time, the priestess also said, "Life to you, my daughter." Ezima's voice from the darkness warmed her mother's heart. She trudged slowly along, and then the priestess screamed, "Somebody's walking behind me," she said. "Whether you are a spirit or man, may Akbala shave your head with a blunt razor. May he twist your neck until you see your heels." Equifi stood rooted to the spot. One mind said to her, "Well, man, go home before Akbala does you harm." But she could not. She stood until Cello had increased the distance between them, and she began to follow again. She had already walked so long that she began to feel a slight numbness in the limbs and in the head. Then it occurred to her that they could not have been headed for the cave. They must have bypassed it long ago. They must be going towards Umwachi, the farthest village in the clan. Cello's voice now came after long intervals. It seemed to Equifi that the night had become a little lighter. The cloud had lifted and a few stars were out. The moon rose late in the night. People said it was refusing food, as a sullen husband refuses his wife's food when they have quarreled. Akbala do Umwachi, Akbala ekini unwo. It was just as Equifi had thought. A priestess was now saluting the village of Umwachi. It was unbelievable, the distance they had covered. As they emerged into the open village from the narrow forest track, the darkness was softened, and it became possible to see the vague shape of trees. Equifi screwed her eyes up in an effort to see her daughter and the priestess, but whenever she thought that she had their shape, it immediately dissolved like a melting lump of darkness. She walked numbly along. Cello's voice was now rising continuously, as when she first set out. Equifi had a fleeing of spacious openness, and she guessed they must be on the village Ilo, or playing ground. And then she realized too, with something like a jerk, that Cello was no longer moving forward. She was in fact returning. Equifi quickly moved away from her line of retreat. Cello passed by, and they began to go back the way they had come. It was a long and weary journey, and Equifi felt like a sleepwalker most of the way. The moon was definitely rising, and although it had not yet appeared on the sky, its light had already melted down the darkness. Equifi could not discern the figure of the priestess and her burden. She slowed down her pace so as to increase the distance between them. She was afraid of what might happen if Cello suddenly turned round and saw her. She had prayed for the moon to rise, but now she found the half-light of the incipient moon more terrifying than darkness. The world was now peopled with vague, fantastic figures that dissolved under her steady gaze, and then formed again in new shapes. At one stage, Equifi was so afraid that she nearly called out to Chilo for companionship and human sympathy. What she had seen was the shape of a man climbing a palm tree, his head pointed to the earth and his legs skywards. But at that very moment, Chilo's voice rose again, and in her possessed chanting, and Equifi recoiled, because there was no humanity there. It was not the same Chelo who sat with her in the market and sometimes bought bean cakes for Enzima, whom she called her daughter. It was a different woman, the priestess of Appala, the oracle of the hills and the caves. Equifi trudged along between two fears. The sound of her benumbed steps seemed to come from some other person walking behind her. Her arms were folded across her bare breasts. Dew fell heavily, and the air was cold. She could no longer think, not even about the terrors of night. She just jogged along in a half-sleep, only waking to full life when Cello sang. At last, it took a turning and began to head for the caves. From then on, Cello never ceased in her chanting. She greeted her God in a multitude of names, the owner of the future, the messenger of the earth, the God who cut a man down when his life was sweetest to him. Equifi was also awakened and her benumbed fears revived. The moon was now up, and she could see Cello and Ezima clearly. How a woman could carry a child of that size so easily and for so long was a miracle. But Equifi was not thinking about that. Cello was not a woman that night. Akbala do, akbala keneo, chinepumadu, ubosi, nduya, natuya, utu, daluo. Equifi could already see the hills looming in the moonlight. They formed a circular ring with a break at the point, through which the foot track led to the center of the circle. As soon as the priestess stepped into this ring of hills, her voice was not only doubled in strength, but was thrown back on all sides. It was indeed the shrine of the great god. Equifi picked her way carefully and quietly. She was already beginning to doubt the wisdom of her coming. Nothing would happen to Ezima, she thought, and if anything happened to her, could she stop it? She would not dare into the underground caves. Her coming was quite useless, she thought. As these things went through her mind, she did not realize how close they were to the cave mouth. And so, when the priestess with Ezima on her back disappeared through a hole hardly big enough to pass a hen, Equifi broke into a run as though to stop them. As she stood gazing at the circular darkness which had swallowed them, tears gushed from her eyes, and she swore within her that if she heard Ezima cry, she would rush into the cave to defend her against all the gods in the world. She would die with her. Having sworn that oath, she sat down on a stony ledge and waited. Her fear had vanished. She could hear the priestess' voice, all its metal taken out of it by the vast emptiness of the cave. She buried her face in the lap and waited. She did not know how long she waited. It must have been a very long time. Her back was turned on the footpath that led out of the hills. She must have heard a noise behind her and turned round sharply. A man stood there with a machete on his hand. Equifi uttered a scream and sprang to her feet. "Don't be foolish," said Okonkwo's voice. "I thought we were going into the shrine with Cello," he mocked. Equifi did not answer. Tears of gratitude filled her eyes. She knew her daughter was safe. "Go home and sleep," said Okonkwo. "I shall wait here." "I shall wait too. It is almost dawn. The first cock has crowed." As they stood there together, Equifi's mind went back to the days when they were young. She had married Anene because Okonkwo was too poor then to marry. 2 years after her marriage to Anene, she could bear no longer, and she decided to run away to Okonkwo. It had been early in the morning. The moon was shining. She was going to the stream to fetch water. Okonkwo's house was on the way to the stream. She went in and knocked at his door and came out. Even in those days, he was not a man of many words. He just carried her into his bed and in the darkness began to feel around her waist for the loose end of her cloth. This is the end of chapter 11 of Things Fall Apart, the book by Chinua Achebe. Read for you by Weirdo. Thank you!